for joining us today for the Crisay lecture. Matt Crisay was the Dean of the Humanities and Social Sciences School. After that, he was the Provost briefly. And then he went to Georgia Tech as the President of Georgia Tech. He played a major role in Atlanta Olympics, right?
Yeah, right.
Long-time Carnegie Mellon person with a PhD from Tepper School. The lecturer today is, you all know him. He is responsible for our being over here, and I want you to recognize that. Mark has been involved at CMUQ during, what are the words? Conception, inception, and all that stuff from day one. He's given more time to this institution than anyone else at Carnegie Mellon University. And it's really a great personal pleasure, professional pleasure to host him today as the speaker, as a lecturer for the Crisay lecture series. Mark served as provost for 14 years, starting in year 2000. Later on, his title changed to Executive VP and Provost. He was the Chief Academic Officer of Carnegie Mellon. That means all the deans reported to him. And in his other role as Executive VP, everybody on campus reported to him. Mark really ran the show during the Jerry Cohen presidency. Jerry served for 16 years, but he was really the external president, and the university was in the good hands of Mark. Mark is an undergraduate degree from Stanford in mathematics, and then a master's and a PhD in economics from Berkeley. And then he came to Carnegie Mellon in 1976 or something like that. And he's been at Carnegie Mellon all these years. He served as the head of the Decision Sciences Department at Humanities and Social Sciences School, which is a digital college now. And then really a distinguished career as the Dean of the High School of, I don't know the name of Public Management and Policy. I've had the good fortune to work with a number of provosts and presidents since I've been at Carnegie Mellon for almost 35 years now. By the way, all presidents, with the exception of Dick Side, came to my office to smoke cigarettes, even after it was banned. We've had distinguished provosts at Carnegie Mellon, whether it's Van Horn in the 70s, and who was the economist from GSI, and then he became president of Colorado, Arnie Weber, and then Angel Jordan, remarkable man with a sponge-like memory. He still knows everybody's salary and age. And then a wonderful man named Paul Cristiano, who loved singing arias. And then Mark Kamlet, different styles. In that group, Mark really distinguished himself in one sense, and that I feel like mentioning here. Mark can go from a very complicated, nasty topic meeting to another one and adjust instantly and get involved in the next meeting. By the way, that's very difficult. When I meet with Halet Harris, it takes me 15 minutes to kind of calm down. If I meet with him, I go to the airport directly. I've never seen Mark angry. I've never seen Mark upset about any issue. He said this remarkably, gifted nature, disposition, and personal style that he's been able to manage a very complicated environment facing all kinds of challenges. I mean, Carnegie Mellon is not a very rich place, as you know. It has a deficit for many years. It wasn't his responsibility, but it was his responsibility to manage the schools. Personal friend, I'm so sorry he left the position, but he will always be my hero. It's a pleasure to introduce you. Speaker today, Dr. Mark Kamlet.
Thanks, Ilker. That's you all are recognize so much that that's over exaggerated. Too bad Holland is still doing all that his duties. I don't know if my voice gets too loud or too soft. Just let me know. It's such a pleasure to be here. I think of all the things that Carnegie Mellon did over the past 15 years. CMUQ is right up at the top of the list. I mean, it is something that we are so proud of and feel has been so successful relative to what we thought we could achieve. And it is very special, and I know from all the time I have been involved that it's all because of you, the people in the audience. And so I want you to know how well you're thought of and how important the Cutter campus has been. It really set the stage for everything that CMU has done internationally, and it is an incredible accomplishment in its own right. It's also really great to be here, as Ilker said, because this talk is named in, for Pat Prieslein. And Pat Prieslein was my mentor, who I met as an undergraduate. And he took me as a graduate student to work with him as an intern at Michigan, and then he moved to Carnegie Mellon, and I followed him, and he gave me my first faculty appointment. So it's doubly nice to have this talk linked to him and his memory. He was an incredible person. So what I want to talk about today, or I should say, as Ilker did, that I was an administrator for many, many, many years at CMU. I stopped at July 1, and so now I'm in a new role. I'm still a faculty member, but I am pleased that it's been fun to get to move from being part of the solution to trying to be part of the problem. So that's it's still a work in progress, but I'm getting there. One of the things I've always been interested in is technology-enhanced learning. And Carnegie Mellon does a lot of it, and you all are involved with different facets of technology-enhanced learning. And so that's what I thought I would share a few thoughts about. Get this. So what I'm going to talk about is shows how when you get this old, I can't even see the slides. I mean, I have to look backwards from time to time. But just to give you a sense, I want to spend a few minutes thinking about what is technology-enhanced learning and some of the challenges that are faced in higher education, especially something called Baumol's disease, which I'll get to in just a second when we get to that part. And I want to talk. In mentioning those, I want to reflect a little bit on the importance of higher education in the United States and beyond. I don't think that will be particularly surprising to you. And then I'll try to link the technology-enhanced learning and the cost part, the financial parts from sections 1 and 2, and speculate for a few minutes on where the field is going after that. Please,
excuse me.
Yeah.
Would you rather move here? There's a screen here. You can see.
Oh, okay. I'll move there. Thank you. Then I can look straight ahead. So to begin, there's the question of what is technology-enhanced learning. And before I get to what I'm going to focus on, let me just throw it open. So what do you think of when you think of technology-enhanced learning? This is not a trick question. I don't have some special definition in mind here, but What are things that come to mind when we say technology enhanced learning?
I believe there are different ones, like for example, you can have some extra material on the computers. So no students can be able to do some work outside of the classrooms by themselves. You can do even more, like having different websites where you can have part of the curriculum actually done on the computer, whichever activity is, and it would be, and sometimes it may even replace the book itself.
That's an excellent definition, and that gets at what I'm going to be talking about. But of course, technology enhanced learning is a pretty intangible or vague term, general term, and there's technology around us in everything we do. If you look at me, I'm mic'd up and I got this thing and I got the slides. We take for granted that there's, you all probably use Blackboard in your classes, and you wouldn't do anything if it wasn't up on the web, and students access the web to go about their work, and they use apps and they do, you know, it's so pervasive. And what I want to focus on is the part of technology enhanced learning really that you've mentioned, which is the role of technology enhanced learning as one of the main components of delivering a class, doing that thing that a faculty member typically does. And so I will omit other things, not because they're not important, but that's what I'll focus on. And in particular, I want to talk about 2 or 3 different approaches, which I would say are, to my mind, the major aspects of what has taken place. One of them is what we'll call MOOCs, and I'll describe what that is. I know you all know what that is, but I'll mention it briefly. Then an alternative that we have focused on a lot at Carnegie Mellon called cognitive tutors. And the world is not just those 2, there's other promising approaches. So I'll talk a little bit, mention them, and I'll just try to do this at a fairly general level to set the stage. So the easiest way for me to think about MOOCs is to step away from the name and to just consider it the broadcasting in some mechanism over the airwaves or online or on a CD or in some fashion of lectures. And if you think about that technology is pretty old. In one sense, the concept of lectures, sort of the sage on the stage who's talking and the audience kind of listening and trying to absorb, that is the fundamental technology, the fundamental production method of teaching that goes back to the Middle Ages. It goes back to the Greeks and the Romans and the first things called schools. And then the broadcasting is that which came about primarily with television and then subsequently the internet, although before television you could take correspondence courses and you could get little things on matchbooks that you would send in, and you could take a correspondence course. So the way that MOOCs hit the, as a term, hit the spotlight was just about 4 or 5 years ago, 7 or 8 years ago. And MOOCs, as you know, stands, I'll probably get this wrong, but stands for Massive Open Online Courses. And these were a set of programs, a set of approaches that several universities championed, either in the form of private companies or as university promoted activities. The first private company that really got a lot of publicity is called Coursera. Coursera came out of faculty at Stanford, although it's not particularly popular at Stanford, but the 2 people who started it were at Stanford. And it's a for-profit financed by venture capital money. This was followed, or perhaps concurrent, with something called edX, which was established at MIT and then became merged with Harvard, so that it became edX when it merged with Harvard. It is basically the exact same, except as a not-for-profit. And each of them developed linkages to sets of universities that signed up under different conditions to offer courses that were recorded by the home university, but broadcast and made available for free to any students literally who wanted to. Sometimes you had to sign up, which was usually just giving your name and your tie into your computer. And the courses, they were courses, and they were structured in a way that the course ended, and there was something you did along the way, that tests or other things, writing papers perhaps, that you got a recognition of having taken the class if you did. And there was a stupendous amount of publicity that said this was going to change the world of higher education, because that was the way that all courses were going to go. And Time Magazine and all the discussions in higher education, many of them believed that this really was the way of the future, and many, many universities, their provosts were under great pressure from lots of people, including their boards, to do something that showed that they were at the frontier of what education was doing, that they were at the frontier of how to deal with costs, because since these courses were free, it was assumed that that would have tremendous impact on lowering tuition, for example. And not knowing exactly if that was the case, nobody wanted to be left behind, and so the vast majority of the AAU universities, the top best-known universities, signed up and started to explore doing these things. The term massive is related to the fact that anybody could take it, and one of the first courses that was offered from Stanford, from a faculty member who now runs Udacity, was an artificial intelligence class, and it had over 100,000 students signed up, so you can get the sense of massive. Open has many meanings, but in this context it basically just means free. Anybody can access it, online courses. So there are many challenges with MOOCs and how they could be, whether or not they'll be an effective way for pedagogy, and whether or not they'll have a big impact on higher education. I won't spend tremendous time on it, just mention a few things, but I'll be happy to come back and we have a discussion. I was a deep skeptic of MOOCs from the very beginning. There are, and CMU never did go that path, although we broadcast all the time, and we've been doing it for 30 years, and their courses you have access to here, from Pittsburgh and vice versa. So, but one of the things that we know from what I'll call the sciences of learning. Sciences of learning is an effort, most of it coming out of psychology, that simply tries to develop an empirical basis for understanding something you would think would have been at the heart of education from the very beginning, which is how do students learn? If you're trying to teach, what's the best way to do that? And one of the first and most robust conclusions is that, generally speaking, lectures are a very ineffective way to teach. And the reason is, and that's true even if you have a very engaging speaker, this is not because people are necessarily not adept, some aren't very good at lecturing, but even for students for faculty who are very good at lecturing. And the reason is that we know that most learning is best if it's learning by doing, and if it's active learning. And and we know that different students learn differently, not necessarily because some are smarter and some are not as smart, but that inherently they learn differently. Their backgrounds could be different, their cultural context and life experiences could be different, and that lecturing, because it is almost inherently one-to-many. Now, it's not quite. In this lecture, you can ask questions and we'll talk. And even in the second generation of MOOCs, there were attempts to get some interactivity, but there is a limitation to how rich the interactive environment can be with MOOCs. And so that in a way, MOOCs are never going to be a game changer for the effectiveness of lecturing. Now, they could be a game changer with regard to the costs of getting those lectures in front of students. If you think about microeconomics, which is a field I got my degrees in, I would guess that around the globe at any moment, there is somebody giving the same lecture, more or less word for word, in microeconomics. And you do sort of wonder if you couldn't economize on having to do all that. The Union of Economics Lecturers wouldn't like it, but is it really necessary to teach by having a whole bunch of different people give lectures that are basically just saying the same thing? Particularly if you worked hard and got the MOOCs to take the best that there is out there and to work on it and have the ability to insert film clips and to try to get interactivity and so forth of some degree. So one would imagine, be great promises for cost impact, but not probably a game changer in terms of kind of the effectiveness of learning. Moreover, one of the other problems with MOOC comes, at least from my perspective, with the very definition of the business model being open. It turns out there are few worse ways to run a business than to not charge for it. That it's a very tough business model to make work. And it's a very expensive undertaking to do this right and to make sure that the computing systems and your sales force and the help desks and the renewal of the versions and somebody to answer all the questions, it's really a fairly massive operation, and making it available for free, we thought, and I think we were right, makes it a very, very difficult thing to pursue. So one of the things when we use broadcasting of lectures, we don't make them open. And of course, so that gets rid of the O, and that gets rid of the M, because the massiveness is just whoever is enrolled in the program. And so now you're down from MOOC to OC, and even them don't really quite do it, because these days you need not be courses. It could be modules, it could be things that are sliced and diced. So it's easy to get MOOC down to just an O, which stands for online. But nevertheless, it is a key aspect of sort of how a lot of the attention on technology-enhanced learning has focused. An alternative is, and the one I'll focus on because it's the one I know best, is one that is expressly based on active learning and through what's called cognitive tutors. And it is coming from work that did start with Herb Simon at Carnegie Mellon in trying to combine the insights of cognitive psychology, which are pretty simple, straightforward insights, with the abilities of artificial intelligence and machine learning once computers came into being. So I can illustrate this best by a series of activities that are linked that I was involved with, starting with Carnegie Learning. And I think I'll just go through them quickly because it explains what I mean and distinguishes it from MOOCs. So Carnegie Learning was a company that we set up. I was chairman of its board for 12 years. And it was designed to teach 7th, 8th, and 9th graders algebra and pre-algebra. And the way it worked was that the student didn't interact with the teacher, the student interacted with the computer. And the computer was not was not just a vehicle for transmitting fixed stuff. It was chock full of all of the lessons that could be learned after scores of years and tens of thousands of students, initially on math and then moving to algebra, on how kids learn and don't learn algebra. And you know, it is the case in many of these things like math or bridge to math, bridge to algebra, that if you sort of fall behind, you sort of lose it because you never sort of get it back. And then you begin to sort of learn things by strange superstitious learning. It kind of works, but you sort of never get the full fundamentals. And the way these processes work is they introduce a basic concept and they put it around what's called a scaffold, in which everything is made so that it's kind of just one thing that you're focusing on. And it's pretty adept at trying to say, do you see this? And in time, people do. And if they don't, it's very straightforward, and it says, okay, well, let's try this another way, and let's try this another way, and let's try this another way. It's infinitely patient. I mean, it is able to go back. It will stay with you with new examples as long as you conceivably are willing as a student to put up with it. And once you have actually got what it is, then it relaxes the scaffold and opens up to other concepts, but always going back to check whether or not you had, make sure you didn't forget. And through that, unravels things. Now, some students are inherently easier and more comfortable with equations, others with graphs, others have the devil with word problems, etc., etc. But all that's sort of embedded in the notion. And it's not so much that you take a class that lasts for a certain period of time and then get tested and then get a grade. You'll get an A if you get through. I mean, it's not a matter of testing, did you get stuff? You will get stuff. You just have to stick with it as it moves you through. So in some sense, the course is the assessment. That is embedded in the fact you did the course is the guarantee and the proof and the tests that sort of go along with it. It turns out that this is a very effective way, at least to teach 7th, 8th, and 9th graders algebra. It's a very important area because in most inter-school systems in the United States, 80% of the students never make it through in any meaningful way algebra or even pre-algebra. And once you sort of don't get that, you sort of fall off you never get into the knowledge economy. And so this company got going, and at its peak about 4 years ago, the peak at least when I was involved with it, we were in 9% of all U.S. public school districts, and we had many hundreds of thousands of students. It's especially effective for students whose background isn't as strong, or so-called at-risk students, because it'll just be as patient as you can imagine. And there were a lot of very expensive studies that the federal government paid for that verified with controlled trials the effectiveness of this kind of an approach. And I'm not here to champion this. I could. Did it for a long time. But I mean, it's just to illustrate for you, it's a different kind of technology-enhanced learning, one that doesn't come as much from lectures as the core. After we sold Carnegie Learning, it was the biggest technology commercialization thing in Carnegie Mellon's history in terms of magnitude. It still is a way to get things to be very cheap, although it's not free, because you can't run the thing if you don't have revenues. It still is very much opposed by the unions and by the impact that it has on teachers and so forth. The Open Learning Initiative is an effort that came up afterwards, which is designed more for college classes. And Acrobatic is a company that we started just about 2 years ago, and I've been involved with it, that is a more private version. The Gates Foundation just last week announced 7 winners of big investments from the Gates Foundation in technology-enhanced learning. They have been studying this, pouring money into the field for 15 years, and of the 7, 2 of them are OLI and Acrobatic. So I do believe this is a sort of a domain of the future. There are other approaches, and I won't spend as much time on them, but I admire them, and I'm not trying to say they aren't also key things that I see are happening in the future. One of them is really coming out of social psychology more than cognitive psychology, which is not so much just how does one brain work, but it's kind of the role. You get you get small groups of younger children together, and one of the more effective ways to teach certain things is to have the students take turns teaching it to each other, which is basically teaching it to themselves. And that's a vast oversimplification. It's just to say that there are lots of avenues out there for fascinating progress to be made in things from that direction. There's a whole set of work in what's called serious gaming that is getting more effective. There's a tremendous amount of edutainment, which is more bells and whistles and have it be fun. And those, I think, are a little bit less effective than necessarily proving how effective they are. But the field is a fascinating one, the whole field of technology-enhanced learning. And I think that it's going to have a tremendous impact on higher ed. You'll see one of the reasons in the next set of topics I'll come to. So if you look at higher education, it is, and I'm going to focus on the U.S., so other contexts will have their different variants, but I'm most familiar with the U.S. context. They're facing a real struggle and trial on many fronts simultaneously, probably more so than has ever been the case since World War II. Out of World War II, the great American research university kind of came into being. They're both public universities, which are these unbelievably fantastic, publicly funded institutions, and there's private institutions, which are very similar, but get their funding from private donations. And in a way, again, biased from where I sit, but one could argue that the strength of American universities, is the strongest sector of and the most important sector of the U.S. economy for its prosperity and its well-being and its growth. It is the thing that takes and turns out the students who have the skills to be the people in the workforce who drive the country. It is the source of the research and the science that is at the heart of innovation and technological change. And to this day, American universities are seen as somewhat of the gold standard, even if now a very challenged gold standard, in terms of something that the U.S. has given a lot of the impetus to. Obviously, the universities weren't created in the U.S., but that I would say the only other industry in the U.S. that comes to my mind that's had quite as big of an influence, for better or for worse, is entertainment, where sort of movies and film and even TV shows and so forth are sort of driven off of the American experience. But what has happened is kind of a triple whammy. One of them is that because the federal budget is so tight, federal funding for research, which is a whole part of the talk that I'm not going to be able to get into, but is such a key aspect to what these institutions are all about, the prospects of funding remaining in real terms what they have been is going down. The NIH budget has now, after doubling up to a certain point in the 90s, it's now on its way back down in real terms, to the point where it's not even clear that the infrastructure of growing PhDs in biological sciences is on a sustainable basis, or the medical schools and academic medical settings can have a viable way forward. NSF's budget is restrained. The spending across the federal government, which is the main source of where funding comes from. So on the research side, things are very tight. On the funding from public funding was the heart of the funding for public universities and has gone down, down, down for a long time. And we can talk about the reasons why. Part is a loss of trust of some sort that the public has in wanting to put money into state universities. I don't know the specifics. We were talking before on UCLA, but what would you guess the amount of public support of UCLA's budget is now?
9%.
9%, so it's 91% non-public, which almost moves it into a category of incidentally public in a certain odd sense. But there's no other source that's come up to replace that. So these are things that such a university just has to figure out how to do without there being a new stream that's coming in. And tuition, which is what I'll turn to here, my next topic, tuition just keeps going up, and it's going up faster than inflation, and it's making debt that students take on go up faster than inflation, and it is to a breaking point. That is to say, there's a saying somebody once said that if it can't keep going like that, it won't. You know, there is not a situation where the tuition increases can continue to rise above in real prices. It just won't work. I mean, it just isn't going to work. Now, I've said all this, and it's true, I believe, for most institutions of U.S. higher education, but there are 5,000 institutions of U.S. higher education, and there are about 10 that are in quite a different category. And those are ones that have endowments, which is the alternative funding mechanism to getting direct grants from the government or from getting public money to support yourself, that have endowments that are so large, they're in a slightly different category. But I think they represent an important group, and I'll come back to them in just a second. So why do the costs of tuition keep going up? So I'll throw this open. Why is that the case? In real terms, most years, most universities, 5-year periods, 10-year periods, 20-year periods, it is true. And why does that happen? You defined higher technology education very well, so I need somebody to tell me why tuition keeps going up. No takers. Well, I'll give you the reason I think. I mean, you could say it's because in public universities, the public support is going down, so tuition has to take its place. It ditto with the decrease in research money from the federal government. But I think the underlying thing is a different thing. And again, it goes in the name Baumol. Baumol's disease. Baumol was a person, so he'll go down in history as named after a disease named after him. He's a very smart guy. But it's a very straightforward observation. And again, Bill Bowen was also sometimes called Baumol-Bowen disease. But it is the fact that when you say something costs something, what you're really doing is you are saying how much it costs relative to everything else. I mean, there's no absolute what does it cost. If you go to a different currency, the numbers change. It's how something costs relative to other things. And the thing that changes how much things cost and trade with one another has to do with the productivity that underlies how they're produced. And so if you think of how much more steel could be produced from 1 hour of labor at making steel now compared to Andrew Carnegie when he got started, or you think every 6 months or every 6 years the amazing difference in what you can get in computers for $1, or growing wheat, or in doing virtually anything, that's because that's known as productivity increase. And the truth is that there is no productivity increase in higher education compared to those other domains. You basically do education with the same fundamental production function that you always did. Somebody teaches, you're spending most of your money on the salaries, some people listen. And it's not only education, there's other areas. Some areas in the arts are the same. How many people does it take to play a string quartet? Still 4. So you're sort of in the same situation when it comes to the basic fundamentals of the economics of education, which is, as long as it's being done that way, you're not having much productivity increase, but you are having productivity increase in virtually all other parts of the economy. And as a result, higher education costs, which is tuition, goes up because all it's reflecting is how much it costs relative to other things. And so when you put it in that point of view, it's sort of easier to see why this happens. And you can get rid of lots and lots of conspiracy theories about how universities are trying to do this or trying to do that, or being run ineffectively or what have you, because at the heart of it, it's the productivity issue. Now, I mentioned the fact that MOOCs and broadcasting lectures may not be perfect in terms of effectiveness, but that's the mode we use now, by and large, and there you can see how productivity could increase. And there's hard ways to kind of say this nicely, but it would involve the same kind of impacts on labor, which is faculty, that happens in all those other industries when you have to deal with it. So that is the basic framework from my point of view of where we sit with regard to these questions of what are the key things we should be thinking about in terms of technology-enhanced learning relative to facing the cost structure and the finance structure and even the pedagogical effectiveness, and what's going on financially in higher education. Now, what I want to do is to sort of close, because I'm supposed to aim this towards about 40 minutes here, so with some speculations in which what I want to suggest is that there's going to be a divergence between institutions in the U.S. that's going to go in two different ways. There's a lot of very good institutions who fall in the category that they're just going to have to cut costs. And they will, maybe the battles will be bloody, but one way or another, they're going to take advantage of the basic cost savings that can be contained, and they are going to proceed to do it. And it's going to be a fairly unpleasant time in terms of the way certain aspects of how faculty take things for granted. And it's going to be very disruptive. You know, that term disruptive technological change is a very trendy one, and we could talk about whether or not this is really a Christensen sort of disruptive technology. But it's going to, and there's a lot of staying power to the status quo, so don't think it's all going to happen tomorrow. But it's built into the system, just like Baumol's disease is. And these pressures are mounting, and you can see how it's changed. We could even talk more about how it's already started to change. I can see it a lot over the last 10 years. And that's not a good or a bad. It means there's still going to be the colleges. It means that the costs are not going to be rising as fast. It also means the way these institutions are run is going to be significantly different. There's a very interesting last group, though, which Carnegie Mellon has spent its time always striving to get into. And that is this elite top set of research universities, both private and public, basically the ones that are in the AAU, which is approximately 60 top universities. And for them, there's an added wrinkle to how the system works. And that is that they focus particularly on getting the most elite students, students who are the most accomplished, and that they get their prestige in part by the prestige of the students. And it's sort of a self-fulfilling cycle, because if you get the best students, then by the way you project things, you have high prestige. If you have high prestige, the best students, want to go to them. And then it develops into a big competition, and entities get 20 times the number of students applying as who can be accepted, and then the school gets to brag about that, and then the very best of the best, and they fight about with each other to see which of those enroll. And we see that all around. I mean, why do you go to Princeton if you get into Princeton? It is in part because you're going to get a great education, fabulous education, but it's also because you got into Princeton. And in fact, just you got into Princeton, that says a lot. That will be sort of all you got to do to get a lot of the credit. You know, I mean, no one says, "How did you do?" It was like, "Kind of, I got into Princeton." And the other thing that you get for going to a Princeton is that you get this 4-year residential experience that provides you with the network of peers that are going to be your network professionally, socially, for your career. And they're going to be immensely valuable. And there's something about this residential experience that has to do with your in close proximity for these 4 years to this group of students. It's something that takes place in the classroom, but it's the residential experience at large. I mean, it's this broader experience. The first set of institutions that I talked about, they're going to want to be cheaper in a more functionalist sense. We're going to give you these courses. We've got technology that works better. We can prove to you that you're going to learn the stuff. The kind of way you're getting ripped off by the private institutions that are getting in a lot of trouble for running these diploma mills, that's not what we're going to do. We're going to give you bona fide, you're going to learn this material. They're going to go in a direction in which that deeper residential experience is not going to be the key. In fact, you'll be doing these things in different online ways where you're not really forming a peer group in the same sense. What's going to happen to these traditional, strongest set of schools? For them, I believe it's going to be sort of a back to the future, in which they will not turn their backs on technology-enhanced learning. In fact, they're going to be some of the leaders in inventing, maybe even commercializing, some of the ways that technology-enhanced learning can come about and can be effective. But what they're going to do is they're going to use the technology-enhanced learning in their university when and where it's appropriate in order to free up faculty to do what clearly humans can do best, and will be for a long time what humans can do best, and that is things that are in the curriculum or in the meta-curriculum, if you will, small seminars, advising, mentoring, capstone experiences, undergraduate research experiences, and other ways in combination with what dorms are going to evolve into sort of the sites for many of these activities. And you see that beginning to happen already, even in the MITs and elsewhere. And for them, it will be technology-enhanced learning being a mechanism, since for them it's not for the money. Their money is graduate these great, unique students who are going to get very rich and give you enough money to make the thing work from a cycle point of view. And it will be to go back to the principles of what was embedded almost in liberal arts colleges, even if it's in the sciences, of spending as much quality of time with the student. That's going to be very disruptive in very different ways than for that first group of students. And I could go into ways that's going to happen. It's not going to be a cakewalk in terms of doing things the way they do now. But in my opinion, that is my guesstimate as to what's going to happen as we look to the future. That technology-enhanced learning is going to have a profound impact on American higher education, but it's going to do so in some very different ways. And come back in 15 years and you'll see if this is right. Thanks. And I came in only 4 minutes late. Pretty good for me. So if there are any questions or topics, there may have to be questions about what I said, just things you may want to opine about, I'd be happy to give you this forum to do so.
I would like to second when you said that actually technology-enhanced learning is going to increase, because also in the psychological research they have found that students learn much more outside of the classroom than in the classroom. And that's why we've been starting to use only for students to prepare for the classroom in order to actually make the learning more positive.
So you might call that, sometimes what they call that is like a flipped classroom. And I have a little editorial coming out, so I'll give Dean Baybar's copy and he can circulate it when it comes out, called Flipped University. Because my kind of hypothesis is that you'll see this flipping for at least these unique, these elite institutions for the whole, it's going to be the whole flipped university, because just what you said, because of just what you said.
So, a couple of very quick questions. A, the top 60 universities that we were talking about heavily rely on research typically.
Yes.
And that's going to be a big impact on the equation that's going to play out in the next, and we had to skip this, I know, because of time, but I'd like to know at least a quick sense of how you see that evolving, because that is a major milestone for both the prestige, the presence of faculty, recruitment and retainment of faculty, etc.
It is the great question.
Right.
Because it's not going to be easy and it's not mapped out. Right now, there's a myth that's kind of played out that a faculty member, whoever he or she is kind of this one thing that's kind of superhuman. And they teach, and they do research, and they mentor, and they advise, and they write grants, and they write research papers, and they commercialize technology. So just like IT tends to disaggregate the different value add points, just like with newspapers. You see this. That's what's going to happen in the deconstruction of the different parts of these research universities. And it was really the great American research university after World War II that kind of has all these weird cross incentives and things that don't make any sense and these flows, but it all sort of worked in a way. And now this is taking them all apart. And how you embed research becomes very difficult, because I believe CMU has moved 15 years ago to have a much more differentiated set of career ladders for faculty. Teaching track, research track, tenure track, et cetera, et cetera. At a conference I was at about 2 years ago, I asked a broad group from the AAU something. I said, well, I know you have these things too. And hardly any of them do, at least not the way that we do. And it won't be the case. I mean, you're going to have a division of labor. And then the question is, so how does this mesh? How does the undergraduate teaching mission and the advanced research mission really mesh? Because it's playing now off of a different thing. And do things go the way of Max Planck Institutes? Do they go different kinds of ways? It's also the case, at least in my view, that things like academic medical centers don't even have a sustainable model for themselves. And that the biological sciences field is in deep sense of crisis. You can now, if you're very successful, you get your first R01 grant to be of significant funding when you're 45 years old. And that's after having been a postdoc for 3 times at some place. It's just not, and there's not enough money coming into the system. It's like, not a Ponzi scheme, but it just doesn't add up. There's not enough money coming in at the top to float the whole thing. So I don't have an answer here. Read my book, maybe then I'll figure it out. Oh, sorry, yes.
So, and I agree with you that the MOOCs do not have a sustainable business model. But what do you think of Minerva, this venture capital-funded university in San Francisco?
Right.
Kind of a hybrid model.
If it works, I think it might be a very interesting model. After all, we at CMU, we run lots and lots and lots of professional master's programs where students pay lots of money for online. Online can be a very useful way of doing it. And a Minerva can simply do it, or somebody will do it, and it'll charge however much money it is, but they'll say it's a very good, it's a very good learning experience.
They're charging much less, but the important thing there is that it is very interactive. So
Mhm.
they use MOOCs on the side.
Mhm. Yeah.
But then you have like a flipped classroom, and that's
Yeah.
where you have the discussion.
Yeah, it's a good point, because once you take one step, why even have the one university remain the university? Why not have entities that specialize in the bringing together of the residential experience and the interactivity gains, and they can, you take this from this university, you take that from that university. It's a good question. And I think that's, in a lot of ways, I've been wrong on this, that I thought that some of these organizations, I know they're not like Minerva, but even ones like Apollo or University of Phoenix and stuff, it would seem if they just play the game right, that they have so much potential advantage, because they don't have to pretend that they're a research institution. They can save all the money off of these big infrastructure kinds of things. They don't have any of the institutional barriers with the tenure. They can put into place other mechanisms for career ladders and for long-term contracts. And you would think that compared to some public systems that have all of the bureaucracy of government control to deal with, that they'd be a lot less nimble and these other institutions could come in. But of course, just the opposite has sort of happened. So Minerva is an interesting one. Mm-hmm.
I feel like the other shoe hasn't dropped yet. So we have the top elite dozen institutions. My impression from your lecture is that for the rest of academia, the robots are going to take over. That they're going to have to become more in line with the rest of the economy and prioritize higher productivity in the future. And that's going to mean fewer faculty members and more technological solutions. Am I reading that wrong?
Well, I hope it's not completely that. I mean, there is a purpose of higher ed, which is providing people with skills that are taught, and that those skills can, even if like algebra, it can be taught. It doesn't mean you have to be robotic in learning algebra. You can, kids learn very differently, and so it wouldn't be that you have to fit into a mold. There are other subjects that are very much more difficult, and I don't pretend otherwise, to imagine some of these technologies quite taking over. But for many of these institutions, you don't have a lot of real in-depth one-on-one interaction. You take very large, kind of third-tier institutions, where second and third-tier institutions, I mean, you're dealing with lots of students, very few faculty, and the students are often non-traditional, and they're there trying to get in and get a master's degree and get a nursing degree, et cetera, et cetera. But it will change. I mean, my argument would be that for what does get provided by these institutions in terms of residential experience can be replicated to some degree, but a lot of the actual teaching part, which isn't much, can be replicated. And the teaching part can, unfortunately, or by necessity, be augmented, but in a way that displaces to a significant degree some of the activity of the faculty.
One observation and then one question. Your slide up there seems to capture really precisely what drives the MBA program.
Which drives the what?
What drives an MBA program?
Yes.
Is exactly captured with that slide. But
Yes.
my question is that one thing that you didn't touch on, it seems like in this age of information that the demand for continuing education has to go through the roof.
Yes.
And that should take up some slack. So I was wondering what are the plans on that front?
Well, let me take the two things. With regard to the MBA, that's certainly true. I know I was acting dean of our business school. Wilker was the guy who ran the business school for 30 years. Right? For one semester, I got my opportunity. So, in the old days, the students came, and then this 2-year program, and so by the beginning of the second year, some of them started to interview for jobs and stuff. And then by the spring of the second year, there was the job market, and so forth. Now, the job market starts in the first few weeks of the first year. That literally. And so the courses for the first year students have to be structured in ways that there are set days off that the recruiters know about. That means every second Thursday you're off. And that gives you time to go fly out for interviews. So they're already moving hugely in the process of getting through their careers, getting the jobs. The employers are out recruiting based on what school they got into. Now, what we've done at the Tepper School is recognizing, because a lot of our students have engineering backgrounds and they don't speak the lingo of business, that what they miss in these interviews until they get something under their, been in class for a while, is just the lingo, the cocktail lingo of stuff. And so now there's like this boot camp, even before school starts. It says, you're smart, you got in, here's a cram course, learn how to say things that sound like you know what you're talking about. Well, the marginal revenue has to be equal to, there's things that you can teach that make you do much better. So it's clear that business schools, and no offense to Harvard Business School and others, I'm sure they do things that are useful for the students, although I think a lot of it is socialization. But in any case, it's a perfect point. Lifelong learning, it seems a huge thing, and I haven't gone into it today. I don't disagree with what you're saying.
2 more questions. Iliana?
So I would like to go back to the big picture of learning in general.
Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned that learning has huge impacts on society.
Yeah.
And the whole mechanism is to get people that wouldn't do so spontaneously to acquire education and learning. Right?
Yeah.
So we've been really successful as a society for low-level things like literacy, like
Yes.
learning to read and write and stuff like that. but we probably will never be able to get everybody to become neurosurgeons. So what can we expect of society? What is the sweet spot?
That is the heart of an American dilemma, isn't it? I mean, if you read, there's a book that came out last year, it's a bestseller, and it's an economics book. And it's very rare for economic books to be bestsellers. And it's particularly rare for a book that is as dry as this book. This is the driest book. I read every single page. It's enormously dry. It's called Capital for the 21st Century by a guy named Piketty. And it's kind of neo-Marxist in the sense that he chose the name as a perfect reference to Das Kapital. And it is trying to sort of argue that there's a real dilemma, that all the money is going to flow to an elite group. Maybe not the smartest, but the way capitalism works, to an elite group, because the returns on labor are simply not going to be there. And of course, that's in great contrast to the American dream, the American story of World War II, that you just, I mean, our advantages, this was a great advantage of our school system in the 1900s, the 1920s, we did have a workforce that was incredibly literate. And we had rules in the US that required you to go to school through 6th grade and then 9th grade and eventually through high school. And that led to a tremendously well-trained workforce. There's another group that's coming at it from the opposite point of view, Piketty, which are kind of the celebrationists of technology. And there's a whole bunch I could name that just say computers are just increasing, artificial intelligence is just increasing its capabilities at such breakneck speed that soon we will have infinite productivity in all disciplines. That just like the advances that we've made in artificial intelligence are as puny now as the things that we've been able to do when we finally got air conditioning or something. But they're on their own Moore's Law. And you let this thing go for another 20 or 30 years, and there's going to be nothing. Energy, agriculture, industrial goods. Now you have 3D printing. That's going to take all of the workers in less developed countries who had low wages, and there'll be no jobs for them because you'll be able to manufacture socks and textiles and everything through 3D printing. And the only people who will have jobs are the ones who are running these machines. I mean, if you look at, say, cotton growing in the United States, so we had the terrible experience of slavery up until 1865, 1866, which was based on having a huge manual labor group. Now we then went through about 70 years of sharecropping, which was the same deal. It's just that the labor force was contained in a different way. Now, you go down to a cotton-producing state in the U.S., there are no people. You can run a gargantuan cotton-producing facility. And there'll be 3 people in lab coats that are running the whole thing. It's all been mechanized. In which case, the dilemma comes up of who can we keep running up a food chain? That's the hope. You keep going up the food chain, and you up the food chain get the advantages, when maybe the food chain's gonna run up faster than you, a human, can. And that's it. I think that's probably the biggest issue that's influencing lots of things in American politics and stuff. But that's all I have time for today. So, thank you.
Final question.
One more.
One more question. Sujan.
When you mentioned, very interesting discussion, thank you so much. When you mentioned highly selective elite students,
Yeah.
what can be the criteria to decide who is highly selective and who
Well, I
is
think-
not? And how to ensure that students actually from all the layers of the society might be? Because, very talented kids can be just belong to poor
Yeah.
families, but have really high motivation, or people who are coming
Well,
from wealthy families.
I think traditionally there was a class linkage between the two, that selective did pertain to demonstration of academic capabilities, but that was biased by all sorts of cultural class-based things, and a lot of work with people showing how all sorts of tests were implicitly class-based, and certainly for people who don't have a lot of books in the house, you don't learn the vocabulary, it makes you do real well Right, and if your English isn't your first language, you know, all those kinds of things. I think that it is the case, in fact, I see this all the time in Chronicle of Higher Education, there is a recognition, and there's been action by some of these richer universities to try to make sure that there is significant financial aid for students who don't have the means, such that they will be able to afford college without getting huge amounts of debt. Carnegie Mellon is unfortunately not one of those universities that has the endowment that can do that. But there are the Magic 12 that basically guarantee that you as a student can reasonably be expected to get out without debt. Now, that's not quite the same thing as saying they've done an effective job of being open to all segments of society, because if you come from a household that doesn't have a lot of books around and a very unnurturing family structure, you're still going to face all those disadvantages. So, it remains a conundrum. But all the factors that you all have listed seem to me to be very crucial, and by not having focused on them, I didn't mean to ignore them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark.
Oh. Oh, isn't this nice? Good. Thank you all very much.
We have a light lunch, and Mark will be around.
And if you have comments, thoughts, or diatribes against what I've said, I'm always interested in people's thinking, because oftentimes I'm wrong, and oftentimes I haven't expressed it very well. So I'm just Kamlet at cmu.edu. So that's
And he'll be back here in future.
yes, I'll be back.
On November 20th, there is a very important panel on cybersecurity.
Yeah, right.
Young man, how you doing? Excellent. Thank you. I woke up.